Hello everyone. Tonight we begin with one of history's strangest obsessions, cutting men down to size, literally, from Chinese officials carrying their own genitals in a box as proof of employment. Two Italian opera stars whose parents traded their childhood for a high note. Two Byzantine generals who commanded armies while being whispered about in palace corridors. Castration has always been more than just a grim punchline. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy wandering through these strange corners of history with me. And I'd love to hear from you. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Now, let's set the mood. Dim the lights, pour yourself some tea, maybe let a fan hum quietly in the background. Settle in, and let's step together into the unsettling, bizarre, and oddly powerful world of the eunuchs. Let me tell you about the person you could have been. Imagine this: you grow up thinking history is neat and tidy. Brave warriors, powerful kings, a few noble queens with very good eyeliner. And then someone drops the word castration into the story, and suddenly the room gets awkwardly quiet. People shuffle, make half-hearted jokes about high notes, and quickly move on. Because castration, in most minds, is this cartoon image: some poor man tied to a stake, hacked at with a rusty knife, ending in a scream, a faint, and probably a funeral. Brutal, humiliating, the end of a life. That's the stereotype, isn't it? The ultimate punishment. The body turned into a grotesque punchline. Except here's the twist: you wouldn't have been just a punchline. You might have been powerful, rich, feared, even envied. History is perverse like that. It takes what we imagine to be the lowest condition, mutilation, and turns it into a ticket to high office, temple wealth, and political intrigue. In fact, entire empires ran on the backsand, missing parts of men who had been altered. And no, it wasn't always forced, it wasn't always fatal, and it definitely wasn't just a medieval horror show. If you'd been born in Byzantium, for instance, castration could open doors that being whole would slam shut. Eunuchs could command armies, negotiate treaties, and serve as trusted imperial advisors. Your lack of heirs meant you weren't a dynastic threat, perfect for an emperor who wanted loyalty without the risk of rebellion. It's not much comfort if you're the one on the surgeon's table, but politically, you suddenly became indispensable. And in China, the imperial palace practically hummed with their presence. Eunuchs weren't just servants, they were administrators, accountants, even admirals. Imagine yourself as Zhang He, the castrated boy turned towering figure who led fleets across the Indian Ocean, with more ships than Columbus could have dreamed of. People bowed to him not out of pity, but out of awe. His missing anatomy wasn't a joke, it was irrelevant next to his power. But of course, there's the irony. You could have been the most feared voice in the palace and still been whispered about behind fans and scrolls. Rumors followed eunuchs like shadows, unnatural, unmanly, monstrous, and yet, society kept producing them, relying on them, even revering them. The contradiction is staggering. One man's mutilation was another man's pathway to influence. Think about it. We like to imagine castration as a footnote in history, a freakish side alley. But the truth, it's the main road. It shaped courts, religions, economies. Without eunuchs, emperors would have drowned in intrigue. Harems would have been impossible to manage, and sacred choirs would have lacked their soaring, impossible voices. Castration wasn't a minor detail, it was the machinery of empires. So, if you'd lived then, you might not have been a nameless victim. You might have been the one holding the imperial seal, or guarding the most intimate chambers of the ruler's house. Not tragic, not peripheral, central, which is why the biggest mistake people make is assuming castration always meant the end. More often, it was just the beginning. See, here's the first thing you'd have gotten wrong if you'd lived back then, or even if you'd just leaned too hard on schoolboy jokes. You hear castration, and you picture the whole package gone. Brutal, absolute, clean sweep. But the truth is a little less tidy. Castration wasn't one thing. It was a menu, and depending on where you lived, you could be served a very different dish. If you'd been caught in the Byzantine Empire, castration usually meant orchiectomy, just the testicles. Painful enough, don't worry, but the penis was often left intact. Why? Because you still needed to urinate. It's hard to manage an empire if your top advisors are dying of infection because someone went overzealous with the knife. Byzantines weren't squeamish, but they were practical. Now, if fate had dumped you in the Ottoman Empire, there were variations. Some procedures removed everything, others didn't. Black eunuchs, often taken from East Africa, were more likely to undergo full emasculation, while white eunuchs from the Balkans often kept part of the equipment. Hierarchy wasn't just about skin or origin, it extended right down to surgical detail. Imagine your entire career prospects decided by how much of you had been cut away. And then there's China, where castration meant the works. Penis and testicles, gone. A total package removal, sealed off with a plug of bamboo during healing, which you had to keep as proof in a little box. Yes, you carried your missing parts around like a bizarre ID card. If you lost that box, your career in the palace could end instantly. Imagine fumbling your entire future, the way someone today might misplace their driver's license. Except this license was your genitals in a jar. The absurdity is that we lump it all under one word, as if there was a single, standardized version of being cut. But in truth, geography dictated your body's fate. In some places you'd still look whole, at least on the outside, while in others you'd be fundamentally altered in ways you could never hide, and even the consequences differed. Some eunuchs remained sexually active, others weren't. Some survived with minimal complications, others lived with lifelong pain. Yet the myth persists that castration always meant a singular, catastrophic act, erasing everything below the belt. It's convenient for imagination, clean, absolute, but history rarely indulges us with neat endings. Instead, it offers this awkward, varied spectrum, where the outcome depended on who captured you, which surgeon was on duty, and whether the gods of infection were feeling merciful that day. So if you'd been standing in that line of boys chosen for palace service, you wouldn't have known until the last moment whether you'd lose part of yourself or all of it. And in the cruel lottery of history, that little distinction might decide whether you lived, how you lived, and how much power you could wield. If you had been one of them, you'd probably expect to be shackled from the start. After all, isn't that the usual image? Castration equals slavery, a brand burned into the flesh. But history laughs at your assumptions, because while yes, thousands of boys were taken and cut against their will captives from wars, raids, or sold by desperate families, not every eunuch was a slave. Some were anything but. Picture Byzantium, the empire that liked its bureaucracy almost as much as its icons. Eunuchs, there weren't just palace janitors. They could become generals, chancellors, even guardians of the emperor himself. Some families imagined this would castrate a promising son on purpose, not out of cruelty but ambition. The logic was cold. A cut son couldn't found a rival dynasty, which made him the perfect candidate for court favor. You weren't selling him into bondage, you were investing in his political future. A gruesome scholarship program. And in China, the system was so well oiled that men actually volunteered. Not out of masochism, but out of hunger for access. Being a eunuch in the Forbidden City meant proximity to the emperor, and proximity meant power. Entire families castrated their sons, betting that one of them might rise high enough to funnel influence and gifts back home. It wasn't slavery. It was a gamble. Brutal, irreversible, but sometimes spectacularly rewarding. Take Zheng He, the Ming dynasty's towering eunuch admiral. He didn't mop floors. He commanded treasure fleets, sailing across the Indian Ocean with hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of men. His castration had been forced. He was a captive, but once inside the system, he became one of the most powerful figures of his age. Imagine yourself standing on the prow of a ship taller than a palace, carrying the emperor's seal, feared and revered from Africa to Arabia. Hardly a life of chains. The Ottomans too had their own hierarchy. Black eunuchs and white eunuchs, each with distinct roles, ranks, and privileges. Some controlled the harem, others the education of princes. The chief black eunuch in particular wielded enormous sway, standing as a gatekeeper between the sultan's family and the world outside. You could be both castrated and indispensable. So no, not every eunuch was a slave in the sense you'd like to imagine. Some were captives, yes. Some were sacrificed by families hoping to climb. Some even offered themselves willingly, chasing proximity to gods and emperors. Castration didn't automatically chain you to the bottom of society. In many cases, it pushed you right into the middle of power. Alright then, let's keep moving into topic 4. Myth 3. Eunuchs were socially marginalized. Here's the next long section, carrying the thread forward. Topic 4. Myth 3. Eunuchs were socially marginalized. If you had been one of them, you might expect to shuffle around in the shadows, a living joke whispered about in taverns, a symbol of humiliation everyone politely avoided. That's the myth, the eunuch as the outcast. But history has a perverse sense of humor, because in many courts, the so-called outcasts were the ones running the show. Take the Byzantine Empire. Eunuchs there weren't hiding in back corridors. They were commanding armies. Narses, the general who crushed the Ostrogoths in Italy in the 6th century, was a eunuch. Imagine yourself standing in full armor, not on the margins but at the center of an imperial campaign, directing troops who probably whispered about your missing parts in the barracks but still followed your orders to the letter. The empire didn't care what you had between your legs, it cared whether you could deliver victories. And in Constantinople, eunuchs weren't barred from high office. Quite the opposite. They were prized for it. Their inability to produce heirs made them politically safe. No sons meant no competing dynasties, no messy coups by nephews. You could hold the keys to the empire and still be trusted not to steal the crown for your children. That wasn't marginalization. That was institutional trust carved into law. China went further. Eunuchs in the Ming dynasty ran the palace. Not figuratively, literally. They handled communications, finances, military logistics. Some even wrote policy. The emperor was divine, yes, but if you wanted something done, you needed the eunuchs. They had the emperor's ear, his household, his schedule. And when you control the daily life of the Son of Heaven, you control the empire itself. That's not being on the margins. That's being the bloodstream of power. Even in the Ottoman Empire, where harems and dynastic politics could swallow entire families whole, eunuchs weren't mere servants. The chief black eunuch was one of the most powerful men in Istanbul, a mediator between the sultan, his family, and the outside world. Courtiers bowed, petitioners begged, viziers schemed, but if you wanted to reach the harem, you needed his approval. People didn't pity him, they feared him. Of course, society couldn't resist the contradictions. Eunuchs were mocked in street songs, caricatured in stories, gossiped about relentlessly. But public sneers didn't erase private power. It's the same way we joke about bureaucrats today, yet line up at their desks because we need that one stamp they control. The eunuchs were never just the joke. They were the punchline and the pen writing the script. So no, you wouldn't have been some marginalized ghost slipping through palace walls. You'd have been right there, in the thick of politics, religion, and war. Trusted, envied, loathed, never ignored. Which brings us to another lazy assumption people still cling to, that castration was some exotic Eastern oddity, something alien to civilized Europe. If you had been alive in Europe, you might like to imagine you were safe from all this. Castration, surely, was something that happened in faraway lands, in the shadow of mosques or behind the lacquered walls of palaces, not in the candlelit chapels of Christendom. But that neat little fantasy crumbles the moment you listen closely to the sound of an 18th century Italian opera house. That piercing, angelic voice cutting through the air. That's not divine intervention. That's castration. Europe, for all its smug superiority, was knee-deep in the practice. The Roman Empire had eunuchs by the thousands, serving in both military and domestic roles. Fast forward a millennium, and you'll find Italian boys marched to the barber surgeons for a very different reason. To preserve their high, clear voices for the stage and the church. They weren't taken to be slaves, they were transformed into castrati singers who dominated music for centuries. Imagine yourself on stage in Naples, dressed in velvet and gold, entire audiences weeping at the power of your voice, never mind that it came at the price of your body. And Europe wasn't just trimming boys for music. The Russian sect, known as the Skopsi, in the 18th and 19th centuries, preached castration as religious purification. Men and sometimes women submitted willingly, believing that cutting the flesh would sever them from sin. Try explaining that at your family dinner table. Their devotion was so intense that authorities persecuted them. But the sect endured, producing thousands of self-mutilated believers. Even in the Christian West, where the body was supposedly sacred, stories of voluntary castration pop up. The church father Origen, for instance, is said to have castrated himself to avoid temptation, a story later condemned, but not forgotten. The practice may have been hidden, but it was never absent. So, the notion that castration is some foreign barbarism, a quirk of distant lands, doesn't hold. It was Roman, it was Italian, it was Russian. It was sung from pulpits, carved into law, whispered in monasteries. Castration was global before globalization had a name. And that's the cruel irony. You could have been born in a quiet Tuscan village and still found yourself under the knife. Not because of war or palace politics, but because your parents thought you had a nice singing voice. Barbarism wasn't always foreign, it was homegrown, applauded, and even set to music. If you had been standing in line for the knife, you might want to believe it was because someone dragged you there, screaming. That's the image that survives. Victims, prisoners, slaves, boys with no choice. And yes, thousands were forced. But history, as usual, complicates the story, because plenty of men walked into it, willingly or at least strategically. Take China's Forbidden City. Families living in poverty sometimes volunteered their sons for castration, because the palace offered food, security, and the faint but dazzling hope of advancement. Imagine your father, weighing a life of subsistence, farming against the possibility of you serving within arm's reach of the Son of Heaven. The knife wasn't just punishment, it was an entrance exam. And yes, it was horrific, but for some families, it was also pragmatic. Religion added its own layer of devotion. In ancient Rome, the priests of Cybele, known as the Galli, famously castrated themselves in ecstatic rituals. Picture yourself in a frenzy of music and incense, cutting away not because someone forced you, but because you believed the goddess demanded it. Pain wasn't humiliation, it was sacrifice. And centuries later, in Russia, the Skopje sect carried this torch, mutilating themselves in pursuit of spiritual purity. They saw it as salvation, not slavery. And then there were the Italian parents, desperate for fame and fortune, willingly offered up their sons to barbarous urchins. It wasn't a secret punishment, it was a calculated career move. If your voice was promising, you might be cut, trained, and launched into a life of celebrity. Families gambled their children's bodies for the applause of Europe's opera houses. For some boys, it meant international stardom. For others, it meant a ruined life. But either way, it wasn't done in chains. So no, you can't cling to the idea that all eunuchs were dragged, kicking and screaming. Sometimes they were pushed, sometimes persuaded, and sometimes they leaped. The motivations ranged from hunger to ambition to faith. And that makes it all the more unsettling, because if mutilation can be seen as opportunity, then the line between victim and participant blurs until it disappears. If you'd been one of them, you might expect to wake up each morning to the sound of laughter your neighbors, convinced that whatever else you did in life, sex was off the table. That's the lazy myth. Eunuchs as neutered dolls, incapable of desire, intimacy, or scandal. But history is rarely so tidy. For starters, castration came in degrees. Orchiectomy, where only the testicles were removed, didn't necessarily eliminate the ability to perform. Desire might diminish, but it didn't vanish altogether. Records show eunuchs marrying, taking concubines, even fathering children before or after their castration. Yes, it sounds like a loophole, but biology is stubborn. Not every cut was absolute, and not every eunuch was celibate. And then there's the theatre of Europe. The castrati, those Italian singers with voices like cathedral bells, were rumored to be anything but chaste. Their unique bodies made them curiosities, yes, but also objects of desire. Women and men alike sought their company. Whispers followed them from stage to salon. Affairs, liaisons, entire subcultures of attraction woven around their altered bodies. They weren't just admired for their voices, they were desired, sometimes dangerously so. China's palaces, meanwhile, produced their own contradictions. Eunuchs were charged with guarding harems precisely because they were considered safe. And yet, scandals of eunuchs engaging in sexual relations with concubines are scattered through the records. Emperors punished them harshly, but the fact remains, they tried, and sometimes succeeded. The myth of absolute impotence didn't hold up under the weight of lived reality. Even the Ottomans, with their rigid hierarchies of eunuchs, left room for ambiguity. Some accounts suggest that not all castration was complete, and those left partially intact could still engage in sexual activity, which makes the neat image of eunuchs as asexual guardians collapse into something far more complicated and human. The irony is sharp. Entire systems of power were built on the assumption that eunuchs were sexually harmless, and yet history shows them slipping into forbidden beds, pursued by admirers, or carving out lives where intimacy was still possible. The idea that castration erased desire was less a medical fact and more a political convenience. So if you'd been one of them, you wouldn't necessarily have lived untouched, loveless, or unwanted. Your body might have been altered, but your humanity messy, desiring, unpredictable, would have remained. And yet people cling to this myth, imagining eunuchs as lifeless husks, when in fact many were scandalously alive. If you'd been waiting your turn, you'd probably imagine the knife was rusty, the floor filthy, and the whole thing a quick descent into screaming and death. That's how most people picture castration: crude, clumsy, like something out of a torture chamber. And yes, sometimes it was exactly that, but not always. Some societies, disturbingly enough, got very good at it. In China, for instance, the procedure was standardized under dynastic rule. Castration there meant the removal of both penis and testicles, what was called the root and stem. Palace medical specialists handled it, using knives, cauterization, and a bamboo plug for healing. Survivors carried their excised parts in a little box as proof of legitimacy. It sounds horrific to modern ears, and it was, but it wasn't amateur hour. The fact that thousands survived to serve long careers in the Forbidden City tells you they knew what they were doing. The Ottomans, too, developed methods that, while still painful, were far from chaotic. Black eunuchs from Africa underwent full emasculation. White eunuchs often orchiectomy. Surgeons in Cairo and Istanbul specialized in the trade, and though mortality was high, it wasn't universal. If every candidate died, the palace system would have collapsed in a year. Even in Europe, where castration for music produced the castrati, barber surgeons learned to perform the operation on boys with surprisingly high survival rates. They used ligatures, cold water, or even pressure methods to reduce bleeding. It was brutal by today's standards, but in its context, it was a refined craft. Parents wouldn't have gambled their sons if it always ended in death. Of course, brutality still haunted the practice. In many slave systems, especially when young captives were prepared for sale in Middle Eastern markets, the operations were done in primitive conditions. Mortality could reach staggering levels. But the point is that the image of universal butchery isn't the whole story. Some lived, many lived, and they lived long enough to rise to power, accumulate wealth, and sometimes outlast their intact contemporaries. So if you'd been on that table, your fate depended less on divine mercy and more on geography and expertise. A skilled palace doctor could turn you into a polished courtier. A careless raider could leave you dead on the floor. And the unsettling truth is that entire empires depended on these procedures being survivable. The myth of always brutal gives people a neat way to dismiss the practice, as though it were just a blood-soaked aberration. But in reality, it was institutional, organized, often professionalized, a ritual of power disguised as surgery. If you'd been waiting your turn, you'd probably imagine the knife was rusty, the floor filthy, and the whole thing a quick descent into screaming and death. That's how most people picture castration: crude, clumsy, like something out of a torture chamber. And yes, sometimes it was exactly that, but not always. Some societies, disturbingly enough, got very good at it. In China, for instance, the procedure was standardized under dynastic rule. Castration there meant the removal of both penis and testicles, what was called the root and stem. Palace medical specialists handled it, using knives, cauterization, and a bamboo plug for healing. Survivors carried their excised parts in a little box as proof of legitimacy. It sounds horrific to modern ears, and it was, but it wasn't amateur hour. The fact that thousands survived to serve long careers in the Forbidden City tells you they knew what they were doing. The Ottomans, too, developed methods that, while still painful, were far from chaotic. Black eunuchs from Africa underwent full emasculation. White eunuchs often orchiectomy. Surgeons in Cairo and Istanbul specialized in the trade, and though mortality was high, it wasn't universal. If every candidate died, the palace system would have collapsed in a year. Even in Europe, where castration for music produced the castrati, barber surgeons learned to perform the operation on boys with surprisingly high survival rates. They used ligatures, cold water, or even pressure methods to reduce bleeding. It was brutal by today's standards, but in its context, it was a refined craft. Parents wouldn't have gambled their sons if it always ended in death. Of course, brutality still haunted the practice. In many slave systems, especially when young captives were prepared for sale in Middle Eastern markets, the operations were done in primitive conditions. Mortality could reach staggering levels. But the point is that the image of universal butchery isn't the whole story. Some lived, many lived, and they lived long enough to rise to power, accumulate wealth, and sometimes outlast their intact contemporaries. So if you'd been on that table, your fate depended less on divine mercy and more on geography and expertise. A skilled palace doctor could turn you into a polished courtier, a careless raider could leave you dead on the floor, and the unsettling truth is that entire empires depended on these procedures being survivable. The myth of always brutal gives people a neat way to dismiss the practice, as though it were just a blood-soaked aberration, but in reality, it was institutional, organized, often professionalized, a ritual of power disguised as surgery. If you had been one of them, you'd probably expect to be remembered as a pale shadow in someone else's story. A servant, a bystander, a background character, politely holding the incense burner while the real men made history. That's the myth. Eunuchs as passive, obedient, too broken to lead. But if you'd worn those robes, you might have discovered that the world didn't treat you as an accessory. It often treated you as the engine. Take Byzantium, where the word eunuch didn't mean frail. It meant trusted, it meant dangerous. Narses, for example, an elderly eunuch, general commanded imperial armies and decisively crushed the Ostrogoths in Italy. He didn't shuffle around corridors with downcast eyes. He was in the field, issuing orders, shaping borders, deciding the fate of kingdoms. If you had been in his sandals, men with beards and airs would have obeyed your every command, not because of pity, but because you delivered victory. And then there's China. Zhang He, a castrated boy from Yunnan, rose to become the great admiral of the Ming dynasty. He commanded treasure fleets so vast that European explorers would have looked like pond fishermen in comparison. Imagine yourself standing on the deck of a colossal flagship, watching entire ports bow to your arrival. Passive, hardly. He carried imperial authority across oceans, his influence stretching from East Africa to the Middle East. The knife didn't make him voiceless, it made him the voice of an empire abroad. Even in the Ottoman Empire, eunuchs weren't confined to shadows. The chief black eunuch, known as the Kizlar-Kosk, held immense power inside the palace, controlling access to the harem and influencing succession. Sultans might have wielded the sword, but this man held the keys. A nod from him could make or break alliances. If you'd been in his position, you'd have learned quickly that silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy. The irony here is sharp. Societies often painted eunuchs as incomplete, but then handed them responsibilities so complete that empires leaned on their judgment. They weren't neutralized, they were weaponized. Their inability to father children didn't make them harmless, it made them the perfect vessels for dangerous trust. So if you'd lived that life, you wouldn't have been erased into passivity. You'd have walked halls where whispers stopped when you entered, where generals waited for your orders, where emperors leaned closer when you spoke. And you would have known something most whole men never grasped, that sometimes losing the chance to build a dynasty gave you the chance to shape one. If you had been one of them, you'd probably assume your body had been altered for one reason only, to keep you out of beds you weren't supposed to enter. That's the neat, scandalized myth that castration was always about sex, always about making men safe around women, or always about pleasing gods with some twisted offering. But if you'd actually lived that life, you would have discovered that your body wasn't just a moral object. It was a political instrument, an economic tool, and sometimes a state strategy sharpened to perfection. Look at the Byzantine court. Eunuchs there weren't castrated just to guard harems or avoid temptation. They were castrated because they couldn't sire rival dynasties. An emperor could elevate you to the highest office without worrying that your son would stage a coup 2 decades later. Castration wasn't about chastity, it was about loyalty engineered by anatomy. In China, eunuchs ran entire departments of state, tax offices, military logistics, even espionage networks. Their altered status gave them a unique function. They were trusted with access to both the emperor and the treasury because they had no sons to inherit, no family lines to expand through corruption. Of course, they still siphoned wealth back to brothers, nephews, and adopted kin, but on paper, they were neutral. Castration wasn't about removing lust, it was about building a bureaucracy that couldn't breed rebellion. And let's not forget the Ottomans. Eunuchs were central figures in the palace, not because of abstinence, but because they were gatekeepers. The chief black eunuch's job was less about supervising women and more about supervising politics. Who got into the harem? Who spoke to the sultan's mother? Who whispered in the ear of the most powerful woman in the empire? That wasn't sexual policing, it was raw influence. Even the famous Italian castrati weren't just about controlling desire. Castration preserved their voices, turning them into cultural commodities. Entire economies of opera houses, churches, and music publishing depended on the sound only a castrato could produce. These men weren't the byproduct of morality, they were the machinery of art, entertainment, and wealth. So if you had been one of them, you'd have realized quickly that your body wasn't simply the solution to some sexual panic or pious frenzy. It was the empire's insurance policy, the treasury's guarantee, the choir's golden ticket. You weren't safe so much as you were indispensable. And yet, people today still cling to this idea that castration was a moral punishment, a kind of one-note cruelty. But history shows it was anything but one note. It was a whole orchestra of motives, economic, political, artistical, playing at once. If you had been one of them, you might expect to be remembered as a circus act, a freak tucked away in the footnotes of music history. That's the myth. The castrati as oddities. Their voices a grotesque accident audiences tolerated out of morbid fascination. But if you'd stood on stage in 17th or 18th century Europe, you'd have known the truth. You weren't a curiosity. You were a star. Castrati weren't the sideshow. They were the main event. In Rome, Naples, and Venice, their voices filled opera houses built specifically to showcase their power. Composers like Handel and Porpora didn't write around them, they wrote for them, sculpting arias that climbed and twisted in ways no other body could manage. Imagine yourself at center stage, velvet-robed, golden lit, 1,000 eyes fixed on you as your voice soared higher than any boy could reach and held longer than any woman could sustain. That wasn't curiosity, was worship. And it wasn't just theater crowds. The church embraced castrati, weaving their voices into choirs where women were banned. The Sistine Chapel itself rang with their sound. Popes defended the practice, even as moralists squirmed. If you had sung there, your voice wasn't scandal, it was the sound of the divine. They were celebrities, pure and simple. Farinelli, the most famous castrato of them all, was courted by kings and begged to sing nightly for a depressed Spanish monarch. Audiences fainted at his performances, nobles showered him with gifts, and he retired wealthy enough to build his own villa. That's not the life of a curiosity, it's the life of an idol. But of course, adoration carried shadows. Behind the fame, many castrati lived conflicted lives. Their bodies mocked even as their voices were adored. They were envied, lusted after, gossiped about. Their existence unsettled people precisely because they didn't fit neat categories. They weren't curiosities, they were contradictions embodied in flesh and song. So if you'd been one, you wouldn't have shuffled onto the stage to polite chuckles. You would have dominated it, your voice commanding silence, desire, awe. You were less a freak than a phenomenon, one Europe built entire industries around. If you had been one of them, you might expect your story to end on the operating table. That's the myth people love. Castration equals death. End of narrative, neat and gory. It's a comforting simplification. If the act itself killed, then history wouldn't need to explain the complicated lives that followed. But if you'd actually lived it, you'd know that death wasn't guaranteed. Survival was common enough to build empires on. In China, thousands of eunuchs filled the Forbidden City, generation after generation. If most had died at the moment of cutting, the palace would have run out of servants within weeks. Palace doctors weren't butchers, they were specialists. Painful, dangerous, yes, but also practiced. Some men survived long enough to become wealthy patrons, temple donors, or even kingmakers. The Ottoman system worked the same way. Mortality among boys castrated in slave markets could be tragically high, especially in unsanitary conditions. But those who survived often lived long lives, some rising to high office, others overseeing harems or state education. They weren't dead men walking, they were political fixtures. And Europe, the castrati are proof enough. If castration had been a certain death sentence, there would have been no Farinelli, no Caffarelli, no gilded arias filling opera houses across the continent. Italian barber surgeons developed methods that, while brutal, often allowed boys to survive into adulthood and beyond, their altered bodies sustaining them through decades of fame. Here's the eerie twist. In some cases, castration may even have prolonged life. Modern medicine suggests that reduced testosterone could protect against prostate disease and lower certain health risks. Some eunuchs lived conspicuously long lives compared to their peers. Imagine the chore mutilation making you the healthiest old man in the court, watching your whole contemporaries collapse from ailments you'd never have. So no, you wouldn't have dropped dead at the surgeon's feet. You'd have risen, limped, healed, and lived on sometimes decades, sometimes extravagantly long, enough time to scheme, to rise in politics, to carve your name in marble, or to sing until audiences wept. The myth of inevitable death is convenient because it spares us the discomfort of imagining altered men in positions of influence. But history doesn't grant us that escape. They lived, and in living, they shaped the very systems that cut them. If you had been one of them, you might assume your life would be a lonely corridor, no children, no descendants, no family dinners where your name gets toasted by a grandson. That's the myth. Eunuchs, as rootless men, cut off from both body and lineage, condemned to die forgotten. But if you'd walked their halls, you'd see that eunuchs built families of a different kind, and their legacies often stretched further than their contemporaries with full households. Take China. Eunuchs there couldn't have biological sons, but adoption was common and respected. Many took on nephews or younger protégés, folding them into networks that lasted generations. They poured wealth into building ancestral halls, sponsoring education, and establishing charities. Their family wasn't erased, it was redirected. Imagine yourself overseeing not a son, but an entire lineage of nephews bound to you by loyalty, each carrying forward your influence long after you were gone. In Byzantium, eunuchs often acted as patrons of monasteries and churches. They couldn't pass their estates to children, but they could carve their names into the stone of cathedrals, fund mosaics that glimmered centuries later, or endow schools that carried their memory. Legacy wasn't a child's face, it was an institution's survival. When later generations bowed, in a chapel lit by oil you'd paid for, they were bowing to your ghost. The Ottomans revealed the same paradox. Palace eunuchs directed fortunes, managed vast treasuries, and distributed patronage. They cultivated webs of clients, dependents, and even adopted children who carried their names. Their bloodlines may have ended, but their political lines often flourished. Their funerals were attended by crowds, their tombs respected, their influence remembered. Even the castrati of Italy, though denied sons, weren't denied legacies. They trained pupils, shaped music, and left repertoires written around their unique voices. When you hear Baroque arias today, you're hearing their fingerprints, echoes of lungs that once shook gilded theaters. Their legacy wasn't genetic, it was cultural, carved into sheet music, and preserved in memory. So if you had been one of them, you wouldn't have drifted into oblivion. Your family might not have looked like the one you picture now, but it was there. Nephews, protégés, disciples, institutions, students. You might not have left behind a surname carried on by sons, but you would have left monuments, melodies, and lineages of influence no blade could sever. If you had been one of them, you'd expect to wake each morning as a ghost of manhood stripped, diminished, a body rewritten into something neither here nor there. That's the myth. Castration as an eraser, masculinity rubbed clean from the parchment. But step into their sandals, and you'd see that masculinity didn't vanish, just shifted, redefined itself in unsettling ways. In Europe, the castrati weren't mocked as men, they were idolized as something beyond men. Their voices weren't fragile, they were volcanic, spanning registers untouched by ordinary mortals. Women fainted, men wept, entire courts bent around their performances. If you had been Farinelli, with audiences collapsing at the sheer force of your lungs, would you have felt less masculine, or simply a new kind of man, one made of sound and spectacle, rather than sons and soldiers? Byzantine eunuchs proved the same point in politics. They couldn't father dynasties, but they could command loyalty. They weren't sidelined. They were promoted, armored, even revered. Their masculinity wasn't in their heirs, but in their power, their control, their ability to act decisively while other men drowned in the weight of family intrigue. You would have been called, not weak, but trustworthy. Your body, recast as a guarantee of stability. And in China, eunuchs weren't treated as neutral husks. They were feared as kingmakers, rulers behind the curtain. Their masculinity was political rather than biological. It was the masculinity of access, the power to whisper in the emperor's ear, to control the palace gates, to make armies move with a signature. Even in the Ottoman harem, eunuchs didn't simply fade into invisibility. Their masculinity was reframed as guardianship, authority, proximity to the most intimate circles of power. They weren't men without force. They were men whose force had been rechanneled into something institutions depended on. The irony is that many eunuchs lived lives coded as intensely mapped in calmness, patrons, voices of empire, while their bodies denied them the biological markers people now associate with manhood. Castration didn't always erase masculinity. It redrafted it, forced it into strange and potent new shapes. So if you had been one of them, you wouldn't have been erased from the category of man. You would have been rewritten inside. It's sometimes idolized, sometimes feared, sometimes resented, but never entirely erased. If you had been one of them, you'd know by now that your life wouldn't have fit neatly into anyone's tidy story. People today still cling to myths because they're easy. Castration was barbaric. Castration was exotic. Castration was the end. But if you'd lived through it, you'd have found something far stranger. Castration wasn't one. It was 1,000. You could have been the eunuch general marching armies across Europe, or the admiral steering treasure fleets into foreign seas. You could have been the chief black eunuch, holding more sway in Istanbul than half the viziers combined. Or the castrato gilded in silk, adored by audiences who didn't see a freak. They saw a star who could pierce the heavens with his voice. You might have been mocked, yes, but you might also have been envied, feared, worshipped. Castration wasn't just about sex, or punishment, or shame. It was economics, politics, theology, art. It kept dynasties safe, choirs filled, courts balanced, treasuries flowing. It wasn't a barbaric footnote, it was infrastructure. Entire empires leaned on men whose bodies had been rewritten. And the myths we've marched through, the idea that castration always killed, always erased, always humiliated, are comforting because they let us dismiss the discomfort. They let us believe this practice lived far away, in other cultures, other centuries, with no relevance to ours. But if you'd been born in the wrong place, at the wrong time, you might have carried that bamboo box in China, sung an aria in Rome, or stood in armor under the Byzantine sun. The eerie truth is that castration didn't just destroy lives, it shaped them, it built legacies. It gave some men the keys to empires, and others the voices that echoed through centuries. And that's why the myths keep failing, because reality is too unsettling, too complicated, too central to ignore. So if you'd been one of them, you wouldn't have been erased. You would have been altered, yes, but also entangled in the machinery of history, an indispensable piece of an uncomfortable puzzle. And maybe that's the sharpest lesson of all. What we like to call barbarism was often the scaffolding of civilization. History has always had a peculiar fascination with bodies that don't fit neatly into categories. The eunuch's body was exactly that, altered, ambiguous, and deeply unsettling to those who valued clear lines between man and woman, warrior and servant, fertile and barren. Castration turned flesh into function, stripping away reproductive power, but layering on a new kind of social utility. The absence of certain organs was not read as a loss, but as a transformation, a deliberate reshaping of the human into something closer to an instrument of governance. For kings and emperors, this strangeness was not a flaw but a feature. An unsexed man was considered safer, no sons to inherit, no wife's family to bargain with, no lust for dynastic ambition simmering beneath polite bows. Yet, paradoxically, this very lack gave rise to a different hunger, one channeled into court politics. Without households to build or bloodlines to defend, eunuchs often became consummate professionals of survival, investing their lives in the only currency left to them, proximity to power. It's tempting to think of them merely as mutilated captives, dragged screaming into palaces, and many were, but the story never fits so comfortably into victimhood alone. In Byzantium, for instance, castration could be a calculated move by ambitious families who offered their children into service, trading their future fertility for the chance at influence within the court. In imperial China, some men voluntarily submitted to the knife, gambling that the loss of one kind of potency could be exchanged for another, pain for access, body for status. This was a transformation the rulers themselves encouraged. They wanted human tools who could handle both intimacy and distance, guardians of thresholds neither fully kin nor fully stranger. Eunuchs became the shadow class, walking proof that power thrives in the margins, not the center. And once established in the palace, they didn't just endure, they learned to maneuver, to whisper, to watch. The body may have been reduced, but the role expanded, drawing them ever closer to the engine of rule. And this brings us to the more curious question. If not all eunuchs were slaves, how exactly did they climb from the margins of society to the heart of political machinery? The answer lies not only in the knife, but in the doorways it opened, the slow, deliberate movement from captives to courtiers. Once inside the palace, the line between prisoner and courtier blurred in ways that could only exist in the strange theater of monarchy. Some eunuchs were indeed taken as war booty or purchased like livestock, but others arrived in very different circumstances. In Byzantium, noble families sometimes chose to have a younger son castrated so he might serve the emperor without ever threatening the family's inheritance line. It sounds grotesque, but it was seen as a kind of investment. Better one altered boy in the palace than another hungry cousin fighting over land. China's imperial courts took the gamble further. The Ming dynasty saw entire classes of men volunteering for the procedure, sneaking into the forbidden city with little more than a basin, a knife, and hope. Many of them were peasants who believed the palace offered a life superior to tilling exhausted soil. The emperor's eunuchs were not just survivors, they were self-made creations, carving out a new category of man not enslaved, not exactly free, but bound to a ruler in ways no ordinary subject could be. In the Ottoman Empire, the divide was sharper. Black eunuchs often came from African slave routes, while white eunuchs were recruited from Christian populations in the Balkans. Both groups could rise, though in different ways, and both show how castration was never a single condition. It created ladders as well as cages. A eunuch might begin as a chained boy and end as a man with wealth, servants of his own, and the ear of the Sultan. This peculiar mixture of humiliation and opportunity made eunuchs extraordinarily adaptive. Their altered bodies were reminders of vulnerability, but their proximity to rulers allowed them to parlay fragility into authority. The court was their ecosystem, closed, suffocating, but rich in chances for those willing to play the long game. Eunuchs learned that power didn't always come from armies or noble bloodlines. Sometimes it came from being the one figure in the palace who couldn't pass his privileges down, who could only hold them tightly in the moment. And so, over centuries, eunuchs shifted from being merely tolerated servants to becoming indispensable brokers. Kings and emperors realized they were not just expendable caretakers but potentially the safest confidants, which leads us directly into the paradox that made them so vital: trust without lineage. Rulers have always been haunted by the same problem. Everyone close to them has an agenda, and most of those agendas end with a nephew or son sitting on the throne. Eunuchs, however, carried no dynastic baggage. They couldn't establish rival houses, no bloodline waiting in the wings to benefit from their influence. In the twisted logic of monarchy, the absence of heirs made them strangely trustworthy. You could hand a eunuch the keys to your treasury, your correspondence, even your harem, and know that he wasn't plotting a family coup behind the scenes. Byzantine emperors leaned on eunuchs for precisely this reason. A general might command loyalty from soldiers who hoped for promotions, a nobleman from peasants on his land, but a eunuch's only real loyalty could be to the emperor himself. Basil the Macedonian, for instance, surrounded himself with eunuchs who not only guarded his chambers but advised on statecraft, becoming the buffer between him and ambitious aristocrats. The eunuch wasn't a competitor, he was a hinge, opening or closing access. The Chinese emperors understood the same logic. During the Ming dynasty, eunuchs like Wei Zhongxian rose to staggering heights, controlling imperial edicts, directing armies, and even deciding which Confucian officials would live or die. Officials despised him, but the emperor trusted him, precisely because Wei Zhongxian had no family empire to build. His fortune began and ended in the palace walls, and that tether made him both powerful and precarious. The Ottomans went further still. The chief black eunuch, the Kisler-Akosk, wielded immense authority, commanding the imperial harem and overseeing the education of princes. He could stand closer to the Sultan than any vizier, and his lack of heirs turned him into a perfect funnel of influence. In a system that thrived on paranoia, eunuchs embodied a peculiar kind of safety. Dangerous, yes, but dangerous without descendants. And yet, what looks like trust on the surface was often something stranger: intimacy made bureaucratic. The eunuchs weren't just record keepers or guards. They were the only men allowed into spaces other men could not enter, which is how they found themselves in the most volatile zone of palace politics: intimacy with power. Palace walls were less about keeping enemies out than keeping secrets in, and eunuchs, with their liminal status, slipped into the most sensitive spaces. They guarded thresholds that no other man could cross: the ruler's private chambers, the women's quarters, the rooms where decisions were whispered before they were announced. This wasn't just about physical access, it was about being present in the very atmosphere where power breathed. In the Ottoman harem, black eunuchs served as both gatekeepers and messengers. They carried letters between the Sultan and his favored consorts, watched the rivalries among the women, and decided who would be presented to the sovereign. It's hard to exaggerate how much sway came from simply controlling the traffic of affection. A eunuch could ruin a concubine by delaying her letter, elevate another by ensuring she appeared at the right hour, or secure alliances by orchestrating encounters, all without uttering a single word in public records. China's Forbidden City followed a similar pattern. Eunuchs became the living seals of intimacy, carrying not just documents but also gestures of trust. When an emperor placed his personal life in their hands, from choosing companions to delivering medicines, the boundary between servant and confidant dissolved. Their bodies, altered and safe, made them acceptable companions in places where no other men were tolerated. That peculiar intimacy created a kind of invisible authority, the power of being present where others were absent. Even in Byzantium, eunuchs often accompanied empresses and princesses, guiding them through corridors, arranging ceremonial appearances, and occasionally serving as their personal advisors. It gave eunuchs influence in two directions: upward to the emperor, sideways into the women's sphere, an advantage no general or minister could match. Yet, intimacy came at a price. Living in those rooms meant constant exposure to volatile affections, jealousies, and private grudges that could spill into statecraft. Eunuchs thrived on the knife's edge between privilege and scapegoat. The palace was both their cage and their throne, and inside it, they learned that being indispensable didn't always mean being safe. Palaces were strange ecosystems, gilded prisons that smelled of incense and sweat, where everyone wanted influence but few ever breathed outside air. For eunuchs, the palace was both confinement and coronation. Their bodies had already been marked by loss, but the palace walls offered a kind of compensation. Here, they could rise higher than most nobles, even while never setting foot beyond the gates. In Byzantium, some eunuchs rose to the rank of parakoimonos, literally, the one who sleeps beside. They didn't just guard the emperor's bedchamber. They dictated policy, managed diplomacy, and sometimes decided who would wear the crown next. Yet, for all that, their world rarely extended past the corridors of the great palace. Imagine commanding armies you would never see, ruling territories you would never visit, shaping futures from behind locked doors. The Ming dynasty offers an even sharper picture. The Forbidden City was designed to suffocate. Thousands of eunuchs worked there, most of them never again touching the outside world. Their days were choreographed, rising at dawn, performing duties in the darkened halls, eating meager food while dressed in silks. The palace was their kingdom and their cage, both at once. They might be feared beyond its walls, but their own lives were tightly bound to its rituals, its rules, its endless intrigues. In the Ottoman world, the chief black eunuch held authority over both the harem and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. From the Sultan's side chambers, he influenced religion, succession, and politics. Yet he remained, technically, a servant, a man whose entire universe was the palace. A life that ended the moment a sultan's trust evaporated. Their rise was spectacular, but always provisional, a throne made of sand that could collapse overnight. This duality, cage and throne, bred a peculiar kind of cunning. Eunuchs learned that to survive, they had to master not just obedience, but calculation. They weren't free to wander, but they were free to listen, free to record, free to remember who whispered what. And in remembering, they discovered a different power. Control not only of people, but of things, the treasuries, the records, the sacred spaces no one else wanted to touch. If nobles fought for land and generals fought for armies, eunuchs learned to fight for ledgers. Control of the invisible money, records, relics, ceremonies, gave them leverage, more subtle and often more devastating than a sword. A eunuch with access to the treasury didn't need a battlefield. He could choke or feed entire provinces with the flick of a pen. Byzantium was notorious for this. Emperors entrusted eunuchs with the imperial finances, partly because they couldn't inherit estates, and partly because they were terrifyingly efficient at remembering who owed what. Many were masters of the paperwork empire, account books, tax receipts, ritual schedules. In a world where most aristocrats barely knew how to read, eunuchs became the literate backbone of administration. the Ming dynasty turned this knack into an art form. The eunuch Zhong Zhuzhang supervised enormous fiscal reforms, balancing imperial accounts with ruthless precision. His colleagues also kept custody of sacred relics and ritual regalia, objects too holy, too politically charged, or simply too tedious for princes to bother with. In their hands, jade seals, silk scrolls, and even imperial kitchens became instruments of control. After all, what good is an emperor if the cooks and accountants decide he eats badly and governs blind? In the Ottoman Empire, the chief black eunuch also managed endowments tied to Mecca and Medina. He was not just a servant of the Sultan, but the invisible hand that moved religious wealth across continents. His authority stretched from Istanbul to Arabia, binding sacred duties to palace politics in ways no vizier could easily untangle. What made this power especially eerie was its quietness. Eunuchs rarely brandished swords. They wielded documents, relics, and rituals, the kind of things most people ignored until suddenly they couldn't. A misplaced seal, an unpaid regiment, a forgotten festival could topple trust in a ruler faster than any rebellion. And eunuchs, ever watchful, understood that the less visible the power, the harder it was to resist. But of course, with secrets and records comes something even more dangerous than wealth: silence. Not speaking, not revealing, not betraying what one has overheard. This was the weapon that turned them into spies, whisperers, and masters of the unsaid. What gave eunuchs their uncanny aura wasn't just proximity or bookkeeping, it was the way they turned silence into a weapon. They were the ears of the palace, always present yet rarely quoted, hearing what generals muttered after too much wine, what concubines wept into silk pillows, what ministers bargained in half whispers. And because eunuchs weren't expected to have households of their own, their knowledge was bottled up, condensed into the perfect form of political currency. In Byzantium, silence made them ideal bodyguards of both flesh and secret. The parakoimonos could overhear imperial quarrels in the bedchamber, and then the next morning deliver instructions to the Senate as though nothing had been said. This discretion made emperors lean on them more than their own brothers. A brother might gossip. A eunuch couldn't afford to. China turned this art of silence into something darker. Eunuchs were often tasked with running the imperial secret police, interrogating courtiers, even torturing those accused of treason. Their ability to remain voiceless in public gave them the perfect cover to be merciless in private. Everyone knew eunuchs were listening. No one could ever tell what they repeated and what they swallowed forever. That uncertainty bred fear more potent than armies. The Ottomans, too, used their chief eunuchs as unseen informants. Within the harem, nothing escaped their gaze. Which concubine plotted, which sultana schemed, which prince sulked. To be silent was to hold a blade without drawing it. The mere possibility of speech made others tremble. Silence, in their hands, became the slow strangulation of rivals, a way to dominate without moving. But silence had its limits. Sometimes it had to break in a whisper to the right ear, at the right moment, tipping the balance of succession or toppling a vizier. And when silence shifted into action, it revealed the other side of eunuch power, revenge of the unsexed. The moments when whispers turned into coups and discreet figures in silk suddenly emerged as kingmakers. Every palace rumor carried the same warning: never underestimate the man who seems least threatening. Eunuchs, stripped of lineage and mocked for their bodies, sometimes wielded their supposed weakness like a concealed dagger. When their silence finally cracked, it often toppled dynasties. In Byzantium, eunuchs didn't just serve emperors. Some became regents in their own right. Joseph Bringers, a eunuch official, effectively ruled the empire in the 10th century, balancing generals against courtiers until the scales tipped fatally against him. Others orchestrated assassinations, smoothing over the blood with ceremonies so neat it almost looked like divine providence. The Ming dynasty's courts saw similar explosions. Wei Zhongxian, once a servant, transformed into a political juggernaut, punishing enemies, promoting allies, and treating the emperor's decrees as his own. Officials hated him not just for his corruption, but for his audacity, a eunuch who acted as if the empire bent around him. His fall was spectacular, but the fear he inspired lingered long after. The Ottomans had their share of quiet avengers. The chief black eunuchs who commanded the harem could make or unmake princes. A whisper in the right chamber might ensure one boy's education was neglected, while another was ushered forward as heir. Entire lines of succession were bent not by viziers' councils or sultanic decrees, but by the invisible hands of men who officially owned nothing and begot no one. Their revenge was never the loud kind. No armies marched under eunuch banners. Instead, their victories were written in who failed to appear at court, who suddenly fell ill, which imperial infants survived the night. They turned their lack of heirs into a brutal freedom, nothing to pass on, nothing to lose, only the satisfaction of reshaping the empire from the shadows. And in shaping it, they became more than individuals. Their altered bodies turned into symbols, projections of society's deepest anxieties, neither fully trusted nor fully despised, both indispensable and cursed. Which is where the story twists again, into the uneasy way their very bodies became political symbols. The eunuch's body was always more than flesh. It was a stage where societies projected their fears, hopes, and contradictions. A eunuch was a man unmade, but also a man remade, not entirely male, not entirely outside of maleness. A reminder that power could be manufactured through mutilation as much as through blood. In Byzantium, the sight of a eunuch in high office unsettled many. On one hand, they were praised as incorruptible servants of the emperor. On the other, their altered bodies made them perpetual targets of ridicule, depicted in satire as grotesque half. The contradiction only heightened their aura. Feared for their proximity to power, mocked for the very condition that made that proximity possible. In imperial China, eunuchs were simultaneously despised as symbols of corruption and revered as instruments of the emperor's will. Their presence in rituals carrying sacred regalia, managing altars, overseeing imperial sacrifices, turned their altered bodies into vessels of cosmic order. Yet those same bodies were used as scapegoats whenever dynasties declined. Too much eunuch power meant the empire had lost its way, or so the story went. The Ottomans, too, embodied this paradox. Black eunuchs, castrated in brutal conditions far from the palace, became the intimate guardians of the sultan's family. Their physical difference marked them as outsiders, but also lent them an aura of sacred service. Their very strangeness was transformed into a guarantee of purity, no threat of seduction, no dynastic ambitions, only the unsettling spectacle of men visibly altered to serve. Everywhere they appeared, eunuchs stood as reminders that power was never natural. It was constructed, imposed on the body, and displayed for others to read. And for centuries, those altered bodies haunted the imagination, at once sacred, shameful, and strangely necessary. But history, with its talent for selective memory, rarely preserves this ambiguity. In modern times, the eunuch is often flattened into caricature, a pitiable servant, a victim, a curiosity. Yet their afterlife in power is stranger, and more unsettling, than the myths suggest. Modern memory has a bad habit of tidying up what was once complicated. Eunuchs remembered today mostly as the butt of jokes, or as tragic curiosities, are rarely granted their full, unnerving legacy. Their centuries of political maneuvering get erased, leaving only the knife and the silence afterward. The irony, of course, is that these figures who once shaped empires are now footnotes in the very histories they once dictated. In Europe, the Byzantine eunuchs who ruled regencies or commanded armies are overshadowed by more palatable emperors and generals. In China, the legacy of eunuchs is reduced to clichés about corruption in the Ming dynasty, as though Wei Zhongxian's excesses told the whole story, ignoring the thousands of eunuchs who ran the day-to-day machinery of empire. And in the Ottoman narrative, the chief black eunuch often vanishes into the margins, remembered only as a servant rather than as the man who managed the empire's holy endowments. The discomfort lies in what eunuchs reveal, that power doesn't always come from bloodlines, swords, or crowns. Sometimes it comes from those who were supposed to have none at all. Their existence unsettles the neat categories of history, reminding us that societies could elevate the altered, the marginal, the mutilated, and place them at the heart of political life. It's easier for modern retellings to dismiss them as victims or grotesques than to acknowledge their role as strategists, manipulators, and sometimes even kingmakers. And so, the afterlife of eunuch power lingers as a kind of ghost, the strange knowledge that the men who were supposed to be least significant often turned out to be most indispensable, forgotten in public memory, yet everywhere in the archival dust of treasuries, letters, and imperial decrees, their fingerprints remain. A shadow empire carved not from lineage, but from absence. In the palaces of old, power was measured not only in gold or bloodlines, but in what one no longer possessed. Castration, that most irreversible of bargains, became the strange entrance ticket to corridors lined with silk and secrets. It began, predictably enough, as an act of punishment, the body marked forever for disobedience or crime. Yet somewhere between the cruelty of rulers and the pragmatism of politics, the knife turned from a tool of humiliation into a perverse form of opportunity. The logic was brutally simple. A man deprived of heirs could not plot dynasties, and a body stripped of virility was no longer seen as a threat in bedrooms where succession was made or unmade. So the cut, once a mark of shame, became a passport. It carried boys from dusty villages into the rarefied air of imperial chambers, where rulers preferred loyalty purchased in flesh over trust rooted in family ties. But mutilation was never just physical, it was symbolic. To cross that threshold meant surrendering one's place in the ordinary world of men for a new, liminal existence. Not entirely one thing, not entirely another, eunuchs lived in the uneasy borderland of society. And that peculiar status gave them a vantage point others lacked, because once blood itself became a passport, proximity to the throne was no longer a matter of lineage or conquest. It was a matter of sacrifice, carefully managed and rewarded with quiet authority. From that moment on, the knife didn't just cut, it carved paths into the very heart of palaces. The wound healed, but the mark endured an invisible seal that opened doors no ordinary servant could walk through. In courts from Byzantium to Beijing, castration was reimagined as a guarantee. No heirs, no tangled lines of inheritance, no private ambitions passed from father to son. A man who could never produce a dynasty was suddenly the safest pair of hands to guard one. Irony, at its sharpest power, secured by those who could never reproduce it. Poor families understood this grim arithmetic all too well. Sons, when altered, became far more valuable than daughters, for their futures stretched beyond the fields and into the very palaces that ruled them. Some were sold, others were taken, and many were told the story of a destiny better than obscurity. The mutilated body became a kind of currency, exchanged for the promise of wealth, position, and survival in systems that otherwise left no space for them. The logic spread like a contagion across empires. What began as a cruel safeguard became institutionalized trust. Eunuchs staffed treasuries, ran armies' pay, and stood sentinel over doors most men could only dream of crossing. They were, by their very absence, made indispensable, and the palace walls, so obsessed with purity and control, leaned heavily on those who had given up the possibility of future generations. It was not just service, it was access, and access in a palace meant everything. For once a man without heirs became the sole keeper of a ruler's secrets. He ceased to be a mere servant and began to whisper into the very machinery of power itself. And that machinery, as it turned, drew them closer to places where secrets were not spoken aloud, but breathed between locked doors and silken curtains. Behind the gilded doors of royal chambers, the eunuch moved like furniture that could listen. Their steps were soft on marble floors, their presence unthreatening yet impossible to ignore. Kings trusted them with the spaces that mattered most: the treasury, the archives, and, most jealously of all, the women's quarters. In cultures where bloodlines determined dynasties, guarding the women meant guarding the future itself. This arrangement was never simply domestic. To watch over the harem was to live at the center of power, disguised as seclusion. Every conversation half heard, every note passed under a door, every nervous glance between concubines and officials, eunuchs absorbed it all. The irony was that those considered emasculated became the most dangerous collectors of secrets, the quiet brokers of whispers that could tip kingdoms off balance. They carried messages no general would dare deliver, arranged encounters the ruler needed discreetly managed, and sometimes even controlled the rhythm of palace life by deciding who gained entry to the royal ear. Their authority rested not in armies or blood, but in the invisible threads of intimacy and discretion. In the hush of corridors, the eunuch's voice became a currency more precious than gold. To know when the ruler slept, when he was angry, or when he was drunk enough to sign anything, such knowledge was power distilled to its most volatile form. And once a man held that, he no longer stood outside politics. He was politics, dressed in silk, moving silently between rooms where shadows decided the fate of empires. The eunuch's real strength lay not in guarding doors, but in opening them, selectively, for others. They became the hinge between ruler and ruled, the interpreter of moods, the translator of whims into commands. Courtiers quickly learned that speaking to the sovereign often meant first speaking to the man without heirs, who could tilt his head slightly and decide whether your petition made it to the throne or died in the dust. It was a delicate art, this role of go-between. A general's message might sound less threatening when softened by a eunuch's careful phrasing. A concubine's plea might become more urgent when whispered by a servant, who knew precisely which tone of voice disarmed the ruler's temper. In a world where direct access was dangerous, mediation was survival, and eunuchs mastered it to perfection. Information flowed through them like water through a hidden channel. They could starve one faction of news while feeding another with carefully chosen rumors. Each whisper carried weight, and each pause was calculated. They didn't need to raise their voice. Silence itself was their weapon, because silence made powerful men anxious, and anxious men were easy to steer. So, in the great theater of the palace, the eunuch stood at center stage while pretending to be invisible. They never commanded armies, yet armies obeyed them. They never wore crowns, yet crowns slipped or tightened at their discretion. And in this strange balance of absence and authority, what had once been a wound became the sharpest instrument of all. What began as mutilation slowly turned into adornment. The eunuch's body, once marked as damaged, was dressed in silks that ordinary men could never afford to touch. In Byzantium, their robes shimmered with colors reserved for the highest ranks. In China, they wore hats and insignia that proclaimed status as loudly as any general's medals. A man deprived of virility was suddenly the peacock of the palace, draped in fabrics that whispered of power. The transformation wasn't accidental. Courts knew that prestige was performance, and the eunuch's ambiguous form needed theater to keep authority intact. Ritual clothing elevated them above ordinary servants, while ornate jewelry blurred the line between guardian and ornament. Shame was overwritten with glamour, the scar rebranded as privilege. To see a eunuch glide through marble halls in jeweled slippers was to be reminded that the palace rewarded loyalty in strange, twisted currencies, and with prestige came ritual titles, the kind that carried the weight of centuries. These weren't just servants, they were keepers of the inner chamber, masters of the seal, grand guardians of the air. Each title wrapped absence in ceremony, until the act of castration itself was reframed as a kind of sacred transformation. It was a curious spectacle. Men whose bodies had been forcibly altered now stood, higher than warriors who had bled for the empire. The knife had cut away their ordinary futures, yes, but in return, it gave them roles no unaltered man could dream of. Prestige became their armor, carefully woven out of humiliation, ceremony, and the glittering distraction of gold-threaded robes. Prestige needed sanctity to endure, and so religion stepped in to bless what politics had already carved. In temples and shrines, eunuchs were presented not merely as servants, but as purified vessels, emptied of lust, incapable, so it was claimed, of staining sacred spaces with the distractions of desire. The body, altered and incomplete, was reimagined as clean, devoted, and therefore closer to the gods than to other men. Ancient cults leaned heavily on this idea. In Mesopotamia, temple attendants who had been cut were said to embody loyalty to divine will. Later, in certain strands of Christianity and Buddhism, voluntary celibacy was praised as spiritual discipline. Enforced emasculation, though far harsher, was justified by the same logic of devotion. The altar and the throne shared a language, purity purchased in flesh. This overlap between palace and temple gave eunuchs an aura no soldier or minister could claim. They weren't just trustworthy in the ruler's bedchamber, they were trustworthy in the gods as well. To deny them influence would be to question the very rituals that sanctified the empire. The irony, of course, was that power dressed as piety has always been the easiest kind to abuse. And abuse it they did. Many eunuchs used their religious roles to blur boundaries, moving effortlessly between priestly duties and palace intrigue. A man who could chant hymns by morning and orchestrate courtly plots by night was not a contradiction. He was a necessity. In societies obsessed with divine order, who better to guard both ruler and ritual than the one believed to have been remade for sacred service? The real test of a eunuch's power came when the ruler's pulse finally stopped. Succession was the most dangerous hour of any dynasty, and in that hour the knife's legacy proved its sharpest. Eunuchs, by virtue of their intimacy, often knew before anyone else that a king had died or was about to. They decided who heard the news, how it was framed, and when it was announced. In palaces where information was life itself, timing turned them into kingmakers. Some locked doors until the right faction was ready. Others smuggled in princes, hiding them in chambers until the moment was ripe. They carried seals, signatures, and whispered instructions that could either crown an heir or quietly erase him. Generals commanded armies, but eunuchs controlled access to the bedchamber, and in monarchies, the bed was always closer to the throne than the battlefield. Dynastic chaos often bore their fingerprints. In Byzantium, factions of eunuchs maneuvered like spiders, weaving webs of alliances behind silken curtains. In Ming China, their networks stretched from the emperor's side to the lowest tax official, allowing them to elevate one heir while dismantling another. Fear of them was not paranoia, it was policy. Rulers trusted eunuchs because they had no sons. Yet that very absence made them terrifyingly impartial, loyal only to survival itself. The machinery of succession wasn't gears and levers. It was human hands that decided whether the crown stayed steady or shattered. And more often than not, those hands bore the invisible mark of the knife, guiding the destiny of empires while appearing to serve it. For all their closeness to kings, eunuchs also ran something less glamorous, but far more decisive. The accounts their unique position cut off from heirs made them ideal custodians of wealth. A man who couldn't pass riches to sons was thought less likely to steal them, though history shows the opposite often unfolded. Palace coffers, tax ledgers, and pay for armies all passed through hands that had long ago been declared harmless. And yet, far from being modest bookkeepers, eunuchs became some of the wealthiest figures in empires. They acquired estates, slaves, and treasures, even if they could not legally establish dynasties. Some funneled fortunes to nephews or adopted sons. Others simply hoarded, their chambers groaning with silver, while soldiers at the frontier went unpaid. The irony was exquisite. Men denied family ties ended up building shadow legacies stronger than those of many noble houses. The trade in eunuchs themselves was its own economy. Poor parents, especially in desperate times, sold sons to intermediaries who supplied palaces with altered boys. Families gambled that mutilation would open a path to privilege otherwise unimaginable. For the boys, there was no choice, only the hope that the knife might lift them from obscurity to jeweled halls. Castration became an investment, grotesque but calculated, a reshaping of flesh into currency. And once within the palace, that investment often paid handsomely. By the late Ming period, eunuchs controlled monopolies, ran salt and grain markets, and taxed provinces more effectively than the bureaucrats trained for the job. A body altered for service became a financial instrument, one that multiplied wealth while tightening control. Eunuchs lived in a peculiar twilight, neither fully men nor women, and that ambiguity was its own form of authority. In societies built on rigid gender lines, they slipped between categories like smoke under a door. They could move freely in harems and women's quarters without scandal, yet sit in councils of war without being dismissed as feminine. Their very presence unsettled, because no one knew quite where to place them. This liminality gave them an edge. They were not bound by the expectations of masculinity, no need to prove virility in battle, no demand to father heirs, nor were they confined by the silence imposed on most women of court. Instead, they occupied a shifting role, one moment a confidant, the next a threat, a figure who could embody softness or severity, depending on what the situation required. Chroniclers often wrote of them in tones of unease, as if their bodies were ghosts haunting the boundaries of identity. Their voices, sometimes high-pitched, sometimes trained into careful neutrality, carried an echo of what was lost. Their clothing, too, was a performance, layered silks that disguised the absence beneath. Even their names were rewritten, often stripped of family ties, and replaced with titles that marked their condition. This strange existence gave them power beyond politics. It gave them mystery. People feared what they couldn't classify, and courts, endlessly theatrical, understood that fear could be cultivated into respect. Eunuchs lived as reminders that identity itself could be reshaped, and that in the reshaping lay a power no sword could cut away. For centuries, eunuchs thrived on the cracks in palaces, those shadowy spaces where secrets mattered more than armies. But eventually, the knife lost its power. As monarchies stumbled into modernity, the very qualities that once made eunuchs indispensable began to mark them as relics. Bureaucracy replaced intimacy. Paper decrees carried more weight than whispered secrets. Armies swore loyalty to salaries, not chambers guarded by men without heirs. Colonial reforms, revolutions, and the rise of new states chipped away at their roles. In Qing China, the once mighty eunuch bureaucracy collapsed with the dynasty itself, remembered less for service than for corruption. In the Ottoman world, reforms cut back harems and stripped eunuchs of influence, leaving behind the echo of their titles without the authority to match. The Byzantine court, long gone, left only bitter chronicles of scheming attendants who had once crowned emperors. What remained was memory, often cruelly distorted. Eunuchs became symbols of decadence, whispered about as manipulators and parasites, their prestige rewritten as infamy. Yet behind the caricature lay the undeniable fact: no palace in antiquity or the medieval world functioned without them. They were both victims of mutilation and architects of empires, caught in the contradiction of being made powerless to become powerful. And so the figure of the eunuch lingers in history like a ghost in silk, half forgotten, half feared, a reminder that influence often grows not from what one possesses, but from what one has been forced to lose.